Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, the Honorable Professor Dr. Aldy Rambe, Spesialis Saraf Konsultan, as the Dean of Medical Faculty, University of North Sumatra. The Honorable Dr. Rini Savitri Daulay, M.Ked Pediatric Spesialis Anak Konsultan as the Chief of Magister Tropical Medicine, Medical Faculty, University of North Sumatra. The Honorable Professor Kim Mulholland as the honorary speaker and the beloved audiences. Let us praise and thank the presence of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for the opportunity and grace so we can attend today's webinar. Not forgetting the salawat and greeting we pour out to the Prophet Muhammad who has brought us out of the dark ages to the era of bright light today. May we all get the intercession on the end. Welcome in the webinar of Magister Tropical Medicine, Medical Faculty, University of North Sumatra. This event was held to commemorate World Pneumonia Day 2021. Before we come to the main session, let's see the video of Magister Tropical Medicine, Medical Faculty, University of North Sumatra, and followed by the Third International Conference of Tropical Medicine and Infectious Disease 2021. Udah dok. Oh ya. All right, ladies and gentlemen, on this nice session, let me deliver the structure of the event today. The first one is opening by MC, and the second is the speech from Professor Aldy, and the third is the lectures from Professor Kim Mulholland and Dr. Rini, discussion and closing. Now, I would like to invite Professor Aldy to give the speech and to open our event. To Prof. Aldy, the screen and time is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good afternoon to all of you. Dear colleagues, first of all, thank God the Almighty who has given His grace and guidance so that the World Pneumonia Day 2021, every breath counts, can be held successfully. Here, I'm very honored to be able to welcome Professor Kim Mulholland from the University of Melbourne, Australia, as he has willingly fulfilled my request to join our event as a speaker later this day. I also would like to give my appreciation to the steering committee of this event, Dr. Rini and Dr. Indri from the Master Program of Tropical Medicine, Medical Faculty, Universitas Sumatera Utara, that has successfully held this event despite the pandemic situation we are currently dealing with. Together today, we are commemorating World Pneumonia Day every year, hoping to raise awareness and advocate action from every sector regarding the prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and also morbidity and mortality of this big infectious disease. Pneumonia is said to be the single biggest infectious killer of adults and children, killed around 2.5 million people in 2019, where deaths from COVID-19 itself will accumulate this number to another million deaths in 2020. Among this infectious etiology, air pollution is the leading risk factor for death from pneumonia across all age groups. These risk factors specifically attenuate the elderly and the children under the age of 5, so that the morbidity and mortality in these groups of age are increasing. The need for clean air action is clear. Reducing air pollution will deliver significant benefits to health and the environment. This World Pneumonia Day, every breath count, is the stepping stone for us to work together to raise awareness about risk factors and focus on equitable access to prevention and treatment of pneumonia. This year's event of World Pneumonia Day also calls governments with heavy burdens of pneumonia and air pollution to commit to reducing air pollution-related pneumonia death by 50% by 2030. Finally, as the Dean of Faculty of Medicine, Universitas Sumatera Utara, I would like to thank all the participants for joining our event today. Let us extend the network and cooperation among all through this event. Have a nice webinar. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Prof. Aldy. Now, we come to the main point of our webinar today. There are lectures from Prof. Kim Mulholland and Dr. Rini. The lectures and discussion will be guided by Dr. Indri as moderator. Before that, I will read the CV of Dr. Indri. Dr. Indri Adriztina, M.Ked, Otorinolaryngology Specialist T.H.T.K.L, medical profession with license and broad certification in ear, nose, and throat specialty in Indonesia. She graduates from University of Sumatera Utara at 2014, and then she continued her study in doctoral program. Right now, she works at Mitra Medica Hospital, Siloam Hospital, and Haji Adam Malik General Hospital, Medan. She is also a lecturer at Medical Faculty, University of North Sumatra. Dr. Indri already has several research paper publication, as you can see. And then, Dr. Indri, the screen and time is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Tiwi, for the introduction. Bismillah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the webinar of Master Program in Tropical Medicine in order to commemorate the World Pneumonia Day to bring attention to the pneumonia and also increase our awareness and knowledge about pneumonia. My name is Indri Adriztina, the moderator of today's webinar. Before we start, let me remind you to submit your question in the chat box, and I will read it at the end of the session. Today, we have two speakers. With the first topic is Pneumonia in Children 2020. Before we start, let me introduce you to our speaker. Professor Kim Mulholland is an Australian pediatrician trained in Melbourne University and the Royal Hospital Melbourne. He joined the Medical Research Council Laboratories Gambia in 1989 and developed a program of research covering all aspects of the problem of childhood pneumonia. He also joined World Health Organization headquarters, where he oversaw the development of standardized method for the evaluation pneumonia vaccine in developing countries. Since leaving World Health Organization in 2000, he has continued to work in pneumonia field with particular emphasis of vaccine. He was the one of the founder of Global Action Plan for Pneumonia. He also has done many research, particularly about pneumococcal vaccine and the development. In the next 45 minutes, we will learn about pneumonia in children 2020. Would you please welcome Professor Kim Mulholland? Please welcome Professor Kim. The screen and time is yours.
Thank you very much, and salam alaikum, everybody. And I appreciate the introduction from the Dean, and I really greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to share my screen now.
Yes, Prof.
Can you see the correct, am I seeing the proper screen now? Is that fine?
Yes, we can see it clear.
That's good. It seems to work 50% of the time in my experience. So my task is to speak about pneumonia in children, which I'm going to do. I want to start by remarking that in the more than 30 years that I've been working in this field, I've had a sense that the interest and the amount of research has declined in recent years. And indeed, my group in Melbourne has undertaken a review of this field over the last 12 months. That review will be published in the Journal of Global Health over the coming months. But it is surprising for me that there hasn't been more active research in this field over this time. And I think that the meeting that we held a week or so back in WHO Geneva indicates to me that the World Health Organization is becoming revitalized in this field. So I'm hoping that we will see more activity in pneumonia research and pneumonia prevention. And I'm very well aware that Indonesia has taken a leading role in this field for quite some time. And I greatly respect the contribution of Indonesia. Just by way of introduction, according to my understanding, pneumonia has been a major cause of child death in communities throughout history, probably always, really. And in the old literature, and I spent some time reviewing papers from the 19th century, in the old literature, it's not get a lot of attention. People focus on things like smallpox and scarlet fever, which they called extrinsic causes coming from the outside. And they tended to regard pneumonia as an intrinsic cause of child death. In other words, the pneumonia death was caused by something within the child themselves. And there is a lot of truth to this, because I think we'll understand that the real causes of pneumonia death are poverty, malnutrition, and poor living conditions. And that was certainly the case in the 19th century. Picture that's shown on this slide is from a very famous European story from the 1845 from Denmark about a little girl who dies on the street, essentially from poverty in Copenhagen. Now, we all recognize that pneumonia continues to be a major cause of child death and the major cause beyond the neonatal period. So this quote from one of the most famous American physicians of the late 19th century is very surprising. William Osler wrote in 1897, "The old are likely to die, the young to recover. Mortality in children has ranged from 1.9 to 3.3%. On the other hand, above 60 years of age, the death rate is high, 50, 60, or even 80%. And this is from the most famous physician of his era. Was he right? Well, a clue to what happened around that time comes from this slide. Now, at that time, at the end of the 19th century in Britain, there were 3 children's hospitals. One which everybody knows of, which is Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. Another in London is called Evelina Hospital, and the third was in Glasgow. Now the graph here, which is not very clear, but you can see where 1900 is limited. This is listed. This is the number of the proportion of admissions in children under the age of 2 years. And before 1880, there was almost none. Why is this? Because it was the policy of the hospitals not to admit children under the age of 2. The doctors were actually forbidden from it. And what you can see is that towards the end of the 19th century, doctors began to admit younger children, but it wasn't really recognized. In fact, they weren't really counted as humans in a way until they got beyond the age of 2. And this is part of the way people were thinking in those days. The infant mortality rate in the United States and Britain at that time was 160 and 140 respectively. So if you think about that, in the United States, in the year 1900, out of every 1,000 children born, 160 were dead in the first year of life. And that's not that long ago. The situation was the same in the UK and the same in all over the world. I have data from India, I'm not going to present, from Mumbai the same year, which shows something closer to 400. So very high child mortality was the norm. I set about looking at the pattern of pneumonia death in children in the United States. Now these graphs I drew with American official data, and the blue line represents the mortality rate in children in the first year of life from pneumonia. And the way to read this is that if you go to the top left-hand corner, can you see my pointer, by the way? Can you see a pointer moving?
Sorry, yes, we can see.
Okay, I'm looking at the wrong screen, I'm sorry. Up here you can see that in the year 1900, out of every 1,000 children who were born, there was about 15 deaths from pneumonia. But in the following 4 years, in each of the following 4 years, there was about 4. So if you multiply those things together, it's about 30 per 1,000, or 3% of children born in America in 1900 died from pneumonia. And then if you follow the curve down, it's quite a dramatic decline between 1900 and 1960. It's a great achievement, actually. And American public health was really going quite well at that time. I've used this graph for teaching students in the UK, where I teach regularly. And I always ask the question, what caused this decline? This is really important. We should know that. And most of them will say antibiotics. So I have to then say, where were antibiotics available? Well, they first became available, as you'll see in a minute, around 1938 or 39. And this was not penicillin, this was sulfonamides. But sulfonamides were still effective at treating childhood pneumonia, as I will show you. So most of the decline that the United States saw before 1940 was due to other factors. Factors like this. This picture from a city in the late 19th century gives you an idea of the kind of pollution that children were exposed to. Not only this, but inside the houses in this city, the children were in houses that were heated with raw coal, and the only cooking fuel for most of these families was coal. So it was coal smoke 24 hours a day for these children. It was an extraordinarily dangerous place for children to live. Now, over that period and before the introduction of antibiotics, we can see a great gradation in the case fatality rate by age. The case fatality rate of pneumonia by age in the first 6 months of life was 40 to 70%. But by the time the children were 3 years old, the figure was very low. And these are the children that William Osler was speaking about when he said the young are likely to recover. He was only considering children of this age and not recognizing this big group here, which were basically children who were susceptible to dying from pneumonia. So the dramatic effect of antibiotics is really seen in this slide. This slide is from a children's hospital in Chicago, and this covers the period immediately before and immediately after the introduction of antibiotics. And the blue bars represent the case fatality rate by age before the introduction and the pale blue after. It's an extraordinary change. You don't need to do a randomized controlled trial to demonstrate that this works. But amazingly, when I started to work in this field in the 1980s, there were some physicians who were working in the World Health Organization meetings arguing that most child pneumonia is viral and we should not be using antibiotics to treat children in the developing world. That argument, I can remember it like it was yesterday. And all they needed to do was to look back at this data and say, why do children die from pneumonia? They die from bacterial pneumonia predominantly. That's very, very clear. If we move forward now to 1990, and this is a map which shows not the number of child deaths. And I should say that I rather object to the way that data is often presented, that this country had so many child deaths and that country had so many child deaths. That's not the critical figure. It's the rate which counts. And here what you see is the annual number of pneumonia deaths per 100,000 children under the age of 5. So it should be only population-based rates which are considered. And in this picture, you can see that sub-Saharan Africa, very severely affected. Also parts of Latin America, particularly Peru and Bolivia, and particularly South Asia and India, with huge numbers of deaths at that time in India, many in Indonesia, Philippines, and Mongolia, where incidentally I'm doing quite a lot of research on pneumonia. So the big change that's taken place is evident on this slide. This is 2017, so it's only 27 years later. And much of the world, there has been a lot of improvement. Central Africa remains a problem, and I suspect that many of the numbers that we are looking at from Central Africa are underestimated anyway. But for Asia, there's been a great deal of improvement, and especially in India and Pakistan, there's been great improvement and huge credit to the people who've been involved in that. But if we look then over this period from 1990 to the current time, in child mortality rates, there's been almost 60% reduction in child mortality, 59% reduction from this figure globally to this figure globally. And we are told that the cause of this is a reduction in pneumonia numbers. I'm not sure about that, because the pneumonia numbers are actually calculated as a fraction of child death rates. In other words, the model that's used to estimate the number of deaths caused by pneumonia in any country is a function of the overall child mortality in that country. So if mortality is higher, the proportion of deaths attributed to pneumonia is higher. So if you reduce the overall mortality, then the model assumes that you will reduce the proportion that's caused by pneumonia. I'm not sure that's true for reasons that I'll come to. These not very good photographs, but still very important photographs, tell me a few messages. Firstly, the photograph on the left is a photograph I took some years ago in a rural part of Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. This child, for me, represents all of the risk factors for pneumonia. This is a child with edematous malnutrition who is living in a very small, poor village. The housing was very poor. There were no windows in the house, and cooking was done inside the house. And so although it's a rural setting, the child was exposed to very high levels of smoke. In addition, he slept in the same room with a number of other children and animals, I believe. And he had no access to vaccines. He was not vaccinated and had no access to treatment should he fall ill. This was a remote place. So that child has all of the kind of classical risk factors for pneumonia and pneumonia death. Moving over to the right side though, and this is not a very good photograph, but it's a more recent picture, which some of you will recognize, is a picture coming from a place called Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And these are the Rohingya people from Myanmar. These are refugees who are living under very difficult conditions. And we see now that these people are subjected to all of the risk factors for pneumonia. And I would suggest that the risk of the children in this community is as high as children in other settings in many years gone by. So we must remember that the world is made up of a lot of different groups of people under different conditions. This graph, which is made from a recent review from the GAP project, is actually from Laos. And these are data from Laos. And they're just looking at some of the key risk factors for pneumonia. Again, trying to understand the reasons for the decline or the apparent decline. Malnutrition has declined from 2000 down to 2011. And on this graph, you can see the orange bars represent the rural area and the blue bars, the urban area. There's been an increase in 2017. And as you'll see in a little while, there's been a substantial increase in malnutrition in most parts of the world with the pandemic. So you can be sure that this curve will be going up now. So increased risk of pneumonia. Breastfeeding rates have improved in Laos over that time. Care seeking for pneumonia symptoms, and here you see a great disparity between urban and rural areas. And those who've traveled in Laos will know that the rural areas there can be quite remote. And for me, Laos and indeed Cambodia are more similar to Africa than they are to the rest of Asia. So this is a sort of pattern. It doesn't tell us a very clear picture. But I would suggest that there are some emerging issues for children which are actually risks that we should be looking at, because these are the things that are going to guide not only pneumonia mortality in the years to come, but child health and indeed the community health in years to come. Climate change has been mentioned, and I would say that climate change is now accepted scientific knowledge. Most of humanity is affected, and people who are living in vulnerable communities are the most effective, as I'll say. It seems to be gathering pace. This is not a linear problem. This is a model which is going to get worse quite quickly unless something happens. And the predicted effects we know: temperature, rising sea level, increasingly unstable weather, and then associated with that, many things like storms, heat waves, bushfires, as we have in Australia, and erratic weather patterns. Now, most of us would look at this and say, it's very clear that this is happening. It's very clear that the world has to really respond and do something. The evidence is overwhelming. But most of us is not always good enough, because sometimes the politicians don't see it that way. We have some very variable politicians in Australia, I would say. This man used to be the Prime Minister, but thankfully he's no longer the Prime Minister. But the denial of the reality of science is a real problem in the world at the moment, I'm afraid. So my question then is, who is actually affected by climate change the most? And this recent event in the Philippines gives you an idea of one of the consequences. The people living in these houses and these dwellings on the edge of the sea, in a very poor and deprived area, are the poorest people in the Philippines. Their survival is marginal. And who are the people who suffer when there is a major problem? It's the same people. And I have no doubt that in Indonesia, it's the same issue. People who are living in the most dangerous areas or the most vulnerable areas are the ones who are susceptible to these kind of changes. So I would say then, for those affected by climate change are the poorest and most marginalized communities. And climate refugees are going to be generated and are being generated by these factors as we speak. We can expect a lot more climate refugees in many areas. In our immediate area, many of the South Pacific island nations are in real trouble. But there's also a pattern of drift to the cities. In rural communities, it's the poorer people who are drifting to the cities. Food insecurity becomes one of the problems. And food insecurity is also going along with poverty and the use of poor fuel, and people living in unsafe and crowded living conditions. And these will be an increasing reality of our cities in the years to come, I'm sad to say. Now, this is a photograph which may not be very familiar to many people here. This is Mongolia. This is the city of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. I took this photograph in the middle of winter. It was as cold as I've ever been in my life. And it was the temperature was about minus 30 degrees centigrade. Now, in the city there, most of the people are living in those traditional dwellings that you can see in the front. 1 or 2 families might live in one room there. It's minus 30 degrees. Their only heating actually is coal. So they heat with coal in a small oven in the middle of the house, and then they have those little chimneys at the top. But at the same time, there are 5 power stations in the city of Ulaanbaatar, and they all burn coal, and they all pump pollution into the atmosphere. It's the most polluted place that I've ever been, actually. And if we think that global warming only affects people in the hot climates, amazingly, it had a major effect in Mongolia, because many of the semi-nomadic communities living in the rural areas have had their livelihoods lost because of climate change. The unstable weather and unpredictable weather, even in Mongolia, has led these people to move to the cities, where they become the poorest people living on the margins of the city. So we're seeing this sort of issue all over the world. Now, coming back to pneumonia, what are the key risk factors for mortality in pneumonia? Malnutrition, air pollution, and unsafe living conditions. I've listed there comorbidities, and that is an increasing risk factor, of course. But we must really think what actually does cause pneumonia. And I go back then to my first slide. And in my first slide, I spoke about the little match girl in Denmark. Poverty, malnutrition, and poor living conditions. These are what really cause pneumonia. But we in medicine, of course, focus on pathogenesis and microbiology because that's where treatment and also prevention comes from. And if I look back over the last 30 years in this field, these things haven't changed very much. There's not very much new information. Streptococcus pneumonia is the leading cause of fatal pneumonia in the world. Staph aureus is actually quite an important player. Early literature, really promoted by WHO, played down the role of Staph aureus. And I think we now realize that the reasons for that are complex, but Staph aureus remains an important secondary cause. Haemophilus influenzae type B, or Hib, was a cause of about 20%. And people may be aware of the excellent research that was done in Indonesia on this subject some years ago. But this is mostly gone because of use of vaccine. Respiratory syncytial virus is the dominant virus, has been always and remains a major problem. And the only other one I've highlighted here is tuberculosis. And this is not, I'm sure this audience is well aware of the role of tuberculosis in childhood pneumonia. Recent studies from Southern Africa have shown that around 10% of children admitted with pneumonia, or between 5 and 10%, have underlying tuberculosis, so something to think about. But the trends are what I want to draw attention to here. Pneumococcal conjugate vaccine and Hib vaccines have reduced bacterial causes of pneumonia, reducing pneumonia. Climate change, urbanization, and increasing pollution are increasing the risk of pneumonia. So these are competing trends in this field. And I'm not going to say more about that, but just want to say a few things about vaccines. Before talking about pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, I would highlight that probably more deaths have been prevented by measles vaccine, measles-related pneumonia, than anything. So measles is an important cause of an important vaccine for the prevention of pneumonia. But I want to say a couple of things about pneumococcal conjugate vaccine and RSV vaccines. Now, this publication from Gavi a few years ago proudly states that the pneumococcal vaccine has saved around 500,000 lives in the world, amongst the world's poorest countries. Now, that seems like a great achievement. Seems like a great achievement. And in fact, even the map of the world showing the countries that are using pneumococcal conjugate vaccine suggests that this is a great achievement. But a closer look at the data, and remember that this map is a little bit hopeful because at least in India, only a number of states have introduced it. I think there might be about half at the moment. So they're sort of in the process of introducing in Indonesia. But, sorry, in India. It's in the process of introducing in Indonesia, in one province, I believe. But in other major countries like Egypt and Morocco and so on, there is no vaccine introduction. And China, it's only available in the private sector. And that is really a problem for me, that there should be a vaccine that's a life-saving vaccine for children, which is most effective for the problems of the poorest children, that is only available in the private sector. That is, to me, something which is fundamentally wrong. I further would say that the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine was actually invented in the 1980s in academic institutions in America, and was passed then from one company to another company to another company, licensed in the year 2000, February of 2000 to be exact, and licensed and sold for the highest price that's ever been charged for a vaccine at that time. So now, in the year 2021, 21 years later, less than half of the world's children have access to this vaccine. This is not something for the global health community to be proud of. And I'm afraid that that's largely due to the fact that capitalism has sort of taken over. There are 2 pneumococcal conjugate vaccines that have been used since 2009. One produced by Pfizer, PCV13, called Prevnar, and the other produced by GSK, PCV10, called Synflorix. There is a third vaccine which is now licensed by WHO, which is another 10-valent vaccine called Pneumosil from the Serum Institute of India, but it has the key serotypes, which I think were missing in the GSK vaccine, 19A, 6A, 3, and sorry, not 3, 19A and 6A. And I believe that Pneumosil will change this pattern and become much more available to the children of the world. A couple of words about RSV vaccines. This is actually where I started my career in the 1980s working on RSV. I believed that it would be solved within a few years. And now, 40 years later, it's still the leading problem in the world. I won't give you the boring, long story of RSV vaccines and why we actually don't have one. We have a product called palivizumab, a monoclonal antibody. It's very expensive. It's actually so expensive that in my hospital in Melbourne, the Children's Hospital, it's only used for children with congenital heart disease who are at highest risk of getting severe RSV disease. It's costly and it has to be given every month during the RSV season. So it's not really the answer. Maternal immunization, interestingly, the first phase 3 trial of an RSV vaccine in the modern era was a maternal vaccine that was produced by Novavax. And the trial was done unwisely, in my opinion, in a large number of sites in over 12 countries for a trial of only 4,000 children. So many sites, many hospitals, many places. And in the end, the trial showed an effectiveness or efficacy of 39%. One below the level that the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA in the US, had said was going to be the cut point. It had to achieve 40%. It didn't. I've reviewed in detail the data from this trial, and it was very clear that if you look at the more important endpoints, it was 60 or 70% effective. And furthermore, when the organizers went back and tried to look at the cases they missed almost half the cases in this study. It was a very poorly done study, and it was poorly done because it was done by a company that had no experience in doing vaccine trials. It was not done by academic groups. All the major trials for pneumococcal vaccines and for other major vaccines have been done by academic groups. And this trend towards companies doing their own trials is a bad one. Another example where a company is doing their own trial is nirsevimab, which is a long-acting monoclonal antibody, not yet available, probably works, will be costly, and there are risks of escape mutants developing. But nevertheless, this will appear at some time in the coming year, I think. Infant immunization is much slower, largely because of the disastrous vaccine trials that took place in the 1960s, in which children who received RSV vaccines suffered more severe disease, in fact, very severe disease, and a couple of them died. And that's really been a problem for this field. So prevention is not just vaccines that I've mentioned, it's prevention of malnutrition, improvement of air quality, and improvement of living conditions, prevention of poverty. I want to say a few words now about treatment. I think everybody here understands the way you treat pneumonia: antibiotics, oxygen, supportive care, fluids, etc., and respiratory support. I just want to tell the story of this place briefly. This is a health center in the northern part of Ethiopia. It's in a very remote place. There's no other health facility for about 100 kilometers in any direction, and it serves a population of several million people. I was asked to review this place, and I was really worried when I saw it. I thought, this is not going to be good. But having spent some time there, I realized that this is a health center that's highly effective. It had, I think, 3 or 4 nurses and a doctor. They were open every day. They were open in the evenings because it was inconvenient for people to come during the day. They had the basic drugs. They provided good advice for the communities, and they followed the pattern of IMCI, which I think everyone's familiar with. One of my students then did a study looking at child mortality by distance from this health centre. So this health centre is seen there as the dot in the middle of this map, this region. And as you move away from that health centre in this very difficult country where the only way for most people to travel is by walking, once you get more than 10 kilometres away, child mortality goes up. And in my opinion, this health centre has a major impact on child survival. So appearances are not everything. It's what's actually done inside that counts. And the IMCI strategy, which I don't have time to go into, which I think everyone is familiar with, is what was being followed in that place and is being followed in many places around the world. And it's very effective. Basically, the strategy is for the first level health facility to treat children who have cough and fast breathing as if they have pneumonia. Chest wall indrawing has already been added to that. And then hospital treatment for those with signs of either hypoxia, more severe disease, or malnutrition, or being very young. Chest wall indrawing is an important physical sign. You can see on this child that he has sternal recession. I've spent a lot of time with groups around the world looking at this physical sign, and many people mistake it for subcostal retractions and other things that involve the soft tissue. This physical sign is about inward movement of the bony structures of the chest wall. The bones move in because the child's pulmonary compliance is reduced and the lungs are stiff, so greater negative pressure has to be generated for the child to breathe in. This child in Philippines who has bronchiolitis also has substantial chest wall indrawing, and here you can see the lower chest wall indrawing, which is evident. So the two places to look for chest wall indrawing are the sternum moving in on this child, or the lower costal margin moving in on this child. In the hospitals, of course, we know antibiotics, nutrition, very important. In many parts of the world, still children in hospital don't get properly nourished. The need for oxygen, increasingly, and I think this is definitely the case in Indonesia, people are increasingly using pulse oximeters to monitor the need for oxygen. This is extremely important. Fluids is important. What about CPAP? For a lot of places that don't have the capacity for ventilation, there's been a trend towards using continuous positive airways pressure. I've also been advocating this, but I just want to make you aware of this study. I'm not saying that this study tells the whole story, but it's quite an important study done by Eric McCollum, an American respiratory physician in Malawi. And in this study, they were randomizing children who had hypoxic pneumonia. These were severely hypoxic children in Malawi with pneumonia. They randomized them and monitored their outcomes. And after 2/3 of the number of children in the sample size had been enrolled, they stopped enrollment because the Data and Safety Monitoring Board told them that the mortality rate was an excess mortality rate in the CPAP group. It's not clear why this happened, but they stopped the study and they put a question mark about the safety of CPAP. There was some evidence of aspiration. There was one child with a pneumothorax. I think the position of WHO is that if you're using CPAP in a hospital without very good nursing care and medical care, it is potentially dangerous. I'm not sure, because I think that there may have been some issues with the randomization here, such that the more severe cases may have got the CPAP. But nevertheless, this is a very influential paper. A few words, I'm running out of time, so a few words on COVID-19 and pneumonia. The invasive pneumococcal disease, and indeed childhood pneumonia, has declined in many parts of the world. In addition, there is a widening measles vaccination gap, and there is increasing malnutrition. All of these things are bad for looking at the outcome of pneumonia. And on top of that, coming back to the original story, around the world, COVID-19 has led to increasing poverty, malnutrition, and marginalization of the poorest communities. I want to draw attention to this excellent study from Indonesia, from Dr. Nastiti and colleagues, which I think shows two things really. It shows that the pandemic is associated with increasing rates of malnutrition, but it also shows that this effect is highly variable, and some areas are more strongly affected than others. And this is a picture of much of the world, I would say, at the moment. This data from WHO shows measles containing vaccine rates. It's a slightly funny thing to look at, but this is from the beginning of 2020 to the end. And what you see, beginning of 2020 to the end of 2020. And in the Afro region, there was a decline in measles immunization, but they picked up very quickly. And this is a reality. In Africa, they've paid a lot of attention to immunization. In the Americas, that decline has been sustained. And in fact, we now see a lot of measles in Brazil, which has coexisted with COVID-19, which is very sad. The Eastern Mediterranean region, a much bigger decline in measles coverage. Southeast Asia, a big drop, which was quite quickly corrected, but still a deficit. And we don't have good data from WIPRO at this stage. So measles declined, measles vaccination has down. But curiously, when we look at pneumococcal isolates, and this study from the Oxford group is a study in many countries in the world looking at the rate of isolation of invasive bacterial disease. And in the same places, 2018, 19, and 20, and as they accumulated pneumococcal isolates, these are blood isolates, roughly the same numbers in 2018 and 2019. In 2020, it went flat when this study finished. Now, they also looked at other pathogens. And here you can see the pneumococcus, but here is Haemophilus and meningococcus, same pattern. So does this tell us that through the pandemic, those pathogens have not been circulating well? I'm not sure. The South Africans have told me that in post-mortem examinations of children who've died from COVID, they found evidence of pneumococcal disease. This study from Israel shows pneumococcal carriage during the pandemic. And the way to look at this is this picture on the left is just carriage rates. And this is a community that's been studied over a number of years. So the carriage rates over those years are shown by the dotted line. The sort of shaded area in the background represents the pandemic. These are COVID cases as they occurred in waves in Israel. And the dark line is pneumococcal carriage during the pandemic. Not much change, actually, surprisingly. Even looking at density, it's about the same. And that's what this picture on the right is. So do we draw the conclusion then that the invasive pneumococcal disease is going to remain down? Well, from the same group in Israel, invasive pneumococcal disease is shown here, and it did stay down at least for the first year. So we think that invasive pneumococcal disease has declined during the pandemic. And I originally assumed that this was due to the viral effects. And this graph from Australia is typical for what's happened with viruses in the temperate climates where we have typically winter epidemics of RSV. The blue line is the average winter in Perth, this is in Australia. Peak of disease in the middle of the year. The black line is the 2020 data, and there was nothing. There was nothing in Melbourne where we are either. And this has happened everywhere around the world, that RSV circulation was stopped by the lockdown procedures and so on, but it caught up later. And when it caught up, it was worse, with more disease and more severe disease. Finally, just the last few words, a few minutes, a couple of comments on humanitarian settings, sort of where we started in a way. In the humanitarian settings where causes of death are collected, pneumonia is a major cause in child death. It's worse in those acute settings And from my own personal experience in the famines in Sudan in the 1980s, this is certainly what I found. And it's associated with malnutrition, air quality, sanitation, and those factors. There's something about dust and remnants of bombs, which I'll come to. But currently, incredibly, actually, there are no guidelines for the use of pneumococcal vaccines in these communities. I think it's unbelievable. We've been trying to do this for over a decade, and there's been groups set up by WHO and nothing has ever happened. So the children who are at highest risk of pneumonia in the world are not getting vaccinated. It's not good. And this picture from Syria, I think, got onto newspapers around the world, showing the sad reality of children in war zones. And this is happening more and more. The targeting of children sounds terrible, but there's no doubt that the targeting of households, homes, and communities is a reality of in many parts of the world. I just want to highlight this point about cluster bombs. Now, the use of cluster bombs is increasing. They've been produced by a lot of countries in the world. One of the biggest producers was the United States, the company called Textor. In fact, Textron. This was Textron's, this is from Textron's website showing how they're good at ethics and compliance. This is a company that makes virtually nothing except for highly sophisticated military weapons. But I've learned recently that Textron has actually been encouraged to stop making cluster bombs, which are basically anti-personnel or even anti-child weapons, because they explode just above the ground. They throw out small bomblets over a wide area. About 5% don't explode, but they'll explode sometime later when a child picks them up. The Americans have stopped making this, but they've done that in favor of a new weapon which they've developed, which is actually just a new kind of cluster bombs. And it's not produced by this company anymore, it's produced by 2 new companies. So they're continuing, they don't stop. And this is the sort of situation that sadly many of the children in the world have to face today. This is a child who's been a victim of cluster bombs. So my conclusions are that pneumonia remains the dominant pediatric problem in the world. The pandemic provides some reduction in ARI cases, but it's worsening the general situation because of increasing poverty and inequity, increasing malnutrition, interrupted immunization, especially measles, and then interrupted access to healthcare for children. So climate change and global insecurity remain major threats to the most vulnerable children, and they compound many of the same effects that we are seeing with COVID-19. So I'm going to stop there, and I apologize if I've gone over time. I haven't been following the time. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It's a very interesting topic. As we know that the pandemic situation could reduce acute respiratory infection, but it also could worsening other situations due to increasing poverty, increasing malnutrition, and interrupted immunization. So maybe the situation should get more attention nowadays. Thank you, Professor Kim. For the participant who have a question for Professor Kim, please write in the chat box, and I will read it at the end of the session. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The second topic is from Dr. Rini Savitri Daulay, M.Ked, pediatrician consultant, Ph.D. with the topic of burden of pneumonia in Indonesia. Dr. Rini has been an academic staff of Respirology Division, Child Health Department, Universitas Sumatera Utara. She is a member of Respirology Coordination Working Group of Indonesian Pediatric Society, and now she is appointed as head of Master Program in Tropical Medicine, Universitas Sumatera Utara. From 2009 until 2010, Dr. Rini joined the fellowship training in Cipto Mangunkusumo Hospital, Jakarta, and in 2015, she also joined the fellowship training in Pediatric Respirology, Vrije University in Amsterdam, Netherlands. Dr. Rini also accomplished pediatric tuberculosis training in Stellenbosch University in South America. So without any further ado, would you please welcome Dr. Rini Savitri Daulay. Please, Doctor, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Indri, for the nice introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Dean of Medical Faculty, Universitas Sumatera Utara, Professor Dr. Aldy Rambe, to give the opening remarks for this event. And furthermore, I would like to thank our special speaker for today, Professor Kim Mulholland. Thank you very much, Prof, for your excellent lecture. It's a great honor to have you here with us. I believe that your expertise in pneumonia will increase our knowledge. And now I would like to talk about the burden of pneumonia in Indonesia. But first, let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Doctor.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So as we know that pneumonia is the world's leading infectious killer of children. Lower respiratory infection remain the world's most deadly communicable disease, ranked as the fourth leading cause of death. It claims the life of more than 800,000 children under the age of 5 every year. It means that more than 2,000 children every day die. This is the list of countries with high burden pneumonia. We can see that Nigeria is leading with the highest burden pneumonia in the world, and Indonesia ranked at the 6th position of countries with high burden pneumonia. Almost all child pneumonia deaths are preventable. However, progress on reducing this death is slow to achieve the SDG target at the end of 2030. The decline of Global Action Plan for Pneumonia and Diarrhea target due to COVID-19 pandemic also contribute to increased number of pneumonia worldwide. In 2018, we can see that the prevalence rate of pneumonia under 5 is 25 per 1,000 live birth, with the mortality rate 4 per 1,000 live birth. Indonesia was one among 3 of 30 pneumonia high burden countries that are tracked to achieve the GAPPD target by 2025. This is the situation of children pneumonia in Indonesia. As we can see that from 2000 until 2018, there is decrease of the case about 54%. And this is the trend in pneumonia mortality in Indonesia. We can see that the mortality rate in 2018 is 4 per 1,000 live birth. And pneumonia is the second biggest killer of children under 5 in 2017. And 2 years ago, COVID-19 pandemic hit us. Data until November 9 to 2021, we can see that we have 249 million cases of COVID-19 in the world with 5 million deaths. And Indonesia, we have 4 million confirmed cases with 143,000 deaths. This is the prevalence of pneumonia in children from 2010 until 2020. We can see it is a decrease. So actually the risk factor of pneumonia is preventable, such as malnutrition, air pollution, low birth weight, access to hand washing, and suboptimal breastfeeding. Child deaths from pneumonia are concentrated in the world's poorest country. It is worsened by the high rates of malnutrition, co-infection with other disease, exposure to polluted air, and limited access to safe water and hygiene. Household air pollution is one of the leading causes of disease and premature death in the developing world. In 2017, we can see that the highest risk factor for child pneumonia death in Indonesia, majority, about 63%, is caused by child wasting, and the rest is caused by indoor air pollution and secondhand smoke. Around 2.6 billion people still cook using solid fuels in the low and middle income countries. This cooking practice will produce higher level of household air pollution. And in poor ventilated dwellings, indoor smoke can be 1,000 times higher than acceptable level for fine particles. The SDG target on 2030 is to reduce neonatal mortality to 12 per 1,000 live birth and under 5 mortality to 25 per 1,000 live birth. The Global Action Plan for Pneumonia and Diarrhea target in 2020 is to reduce child pneumonia death to less than 3 for every 1,000 live birth and diarrhea death to less than 2 for every 1,000 live birth. We can fighting and combat children pneumonia with protection, prevention, and treat. So we can prevent pneumonia in children by increase the vaccination coverage and improve access to safe water, and also with the reduced air pollution. And we can protect children from pneumonia by improve breastfeeding practice and ensure adequate nutrition for the children. And if the children already suffer for pneumonia, we have to make sure that they are diagnosed and treated effectively. So we can prevent pneumonia in children with increasing vaccination coverage. Improved vaccination coverage has contributed to significant reduction in pneumonia. Vaccines that protect against pneumonia are Haemophilus influenza B, PCV vaccine, measles vaccine, and DTP. However, nearly 20 million children still miss out the basic vaccination. It is put them in the higher risk of pneumonia. Air pollution, both indoor and outdoor air pollution, is a significant risk factor for pneumonia death among children. 62% of pollution-related pneumonia death. Water, sanitation, and hygiene intervention also the key to prevent the spread of pneumonia. Good hygiene practice can reduce pneumonia up to 50%. We can protect our children with improving breastfeeding practice. The data show that breastfeed infant will reduction of pneumonia incidence until 23%. And in infants who were never breastfed at all, the higher risk will be 15 times more. Undernourished infants face a higher risk of disease. So it is important to ensure that the children have the adequate nutrition. This is the pneumonia symptoms. Usually people with pneumonia will suffer for shortness of breath, chest pain, productive cough, fever, sweating, chills. So if the person or the children already diagnosed with pneumonia, we have to make sure that the children is brought to the care to get the effective treatment. Because globally, only 68% of children with suspected pneumonia are taken to the health facility. A health worker with the right training, skills, medicines, and supplies based in a functional healthcare is needed to prevent and treat pneumonia. Because we know there are health worker shortage are most widespread in low and middle income countries. And we have to make sure that the availability of amoxicillin and medical oxygen as the first line treatment for childhood pneumonia is available. because the ability to detect and treat hypoxemia in neonates and children under 5 is critical to reducing mortality rate. Achieving universal health coverage is one way to end the pneumonia. So what can we do to combat childhood pneumonia? We can do some action, such as develop pneumonia control strategies. We have to make sure that strengthen our quality primary health care, and then the government domestic have to increase the investment in health and nutrition. To accelerate vaccination coverage is a must, and we need to engage with the private sector of improved access to affordable quality vaccine and drugs. And we have to prioritize research, development, and innovation in pneumonia. So this will be my last slide. Please keep in mind that pneumonia is a preventable and treatable disease. Yet it remains a leading cause of death in children under 5 years of age. Preventing and treating pneumonia are the key component in the reducing child deaths. We all have a role to play in ending pneumonia death by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rini. That is a very insightful presentation. Maybe now we move on to the discussion session. Is there any question from the participant? For the question in the chat box from Dr. Inke, I think already answered by Professor Kim. Thank you, Professor Kim. If there are any question, any other question? Okay, before maybe I want to ask.
Would you like me to comment on that question?
Yeah, please, Prof. Would you comment?
Yeah, no, I think the question that's been raised by Dr. Inke is a very critical question. There's been a lot of people have spent a lot of time looking at lists of serotypes from different countries. And this was a real issue when the only PCV we had was PCV7, which was the first one licensed in 2000. But with the current generation, the coverage, the difference between the vaccines is very small. And if you take into account the fact that the Synflorix, the GSK product, actually has some cross-protection for the missing serotypes. So the two most important serotypes which Prevnar has that Synflorix does not have are 6A and 19A. And yet Synflorix does provide some protection against those. We've been able to show that. The other serotype which is different in those two vaccines is type 3. And I'm sorry, but type 3 vaccine does not work. And we still see type 3 disease in vaccinated communities. So it's only those two serotypes, and they don't make a lot of difference, to be honest. All three vaccines that are available, including the Indian vaccine, are all effective. I can see Dr. Inke has appeared.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Is there any other question from the participant? There is a question from Dr. Nicholas.
Oh, this is a.
In your opinion and the data we'll have, how is the prospect of the problem that living in a marginalized area can increase the poverty and malnutrition sanitation are the major problem in pneumonia mortality? Could it be possible that more resistant pneumonia is created to this living condition, which in turn will cause the control of this problem is more hindered than before? In your opinion and data the world have, how is the prospect, Prof? And could we control the pneumonia in targeted years?
Okay. Firstly, yes, I think that this is a major problem. And we are going to see we're going to see more pneumonia coming from these marginalized communities without good living conditions, living in crowded conditions. They will have higher rates of carriage and higher pneumonia rates for all the reasons that we mentioned. The question of resistance is quite an important one. we don't speak about it as often as perhaps we should. The reality is that after 30 years, amoxicillin remains a highly effective antibiotic for treating children with pneumonia. You know, people give Augmentin now. There's not much evidence that that makes much difference. And if one of my children, not my children now, but my grandchildren was getting pneumonia, I would be more than happy for them to be prescribed with amoxicillin. So the more sophisticated antibiotics we see, azithromycin and these other antibiotics, are actually more problematic when it comes to resistance. There's more evidence that the macrolides and the azolides, which is the related class, that they generate more resistance, and that resistance actually leads to treatment failure. There's not much evidence that the penicillin resistance leads to significant treatment failure if children are given the right dose. And because of the nature of penicillin resistance, in pneumococcus at least, simply increasing the dose is often all that's needed. So we make too much of resistance when we're talking about pneumonia. This is not the situation with meningitis. And I think everybody is aware that meningitis is acutely sensitive to antimicrobial resistance. You use the wrong antibiotics and the person will die.
Thank you, Prof. Speaking of giving the amoxicillin as the first dose therapy, a first-line therapy, how do you defining treatment failure in pneumonia case in pediatrician, Prof? How long should we follow up the patient in giving the amoxicillin?
Well, that's actually a critical question, a very important question. We see a lot of treatment failure, and in even the mildest cases, we see about 5 or 7% treatment failure in the trials. But when you look closely at those cases, most of them have viral infection. The course of an RSV infection can last for a week. And so if we define treatment failure by day 4 or day 7, some of those viral cases will still be sick. And so one has to be careful about saying what is a real failure here. I think the counter side to that is that in children who suffer from malnutrition, and this is the group that I think have the highest risk, of course, of treatment failure leading to death, in this group, there is a high rate of treatment failure that does lead to death. And some of those cases will be tuberculosis. It's not been correctly diagnosed. Other cases may actually be simply recurrent pneumonia. And children who have pneumonia and malnutrition, in my opinion, should be followed very carefully. And we've in Africa, in the years that I was studying this in Africa, we found quite a high rate of mortality in the 3 months following discharge. So children with malnutrition will often improve and then deteriorate. So it's different for that kind of a child. For a child who's otherwise healthy and has been responded well to treatment, then a short one follow-up is enough, probably.
Thank you, Prof. Maybe we move on to the next question from Robi Awaludin. He asked, recurrent pneumonia may caused by underlying disease, malnutrition, and etc. What nutrition that mostly related to pneumonia severity, because it's important, especially in poverty environment. What are the nutrition that mostly related to?
It's a kind of interesting question. It's an interesting question because mostly we associate protein energy malnutrition or protein calorie malnutrition, you know, marasmus kwashiorkor, these kind of conditions are the ones that are usually associated with severe pneumonia. But it does raise other questions about, you know, vitamin deficiency, for example. And we know that, you know, vitamin D deficiency has been associated with susceptibility to pneumonia. And it's particularly a factor in some of the poorer settings. I mentioned Mongolia before. And in that cold environment, children have extremely low vitamin D levels in the winter months. So vitamin D deficiency seems to be a factor there. There may be other situations where people have talked about various vitamin B deficiencies, but I think this has not been proven. I think for the most part, it's protein energy or protein calorie malnutrition that is the main factor. But we do have to look at other things. I mean, anemia is also a factor. Actually, I should mention that as well.
Thank you, Prof. Maybe we move on to the next question from Dr. Inke. There were an increased use of azithromycin, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Have you seen reports of increased resistance to this drug for treatment of pneumonia, Prof? Often in private practice in Indonesia, azithromycin is the drug choice due to the short-term treatment.
Yeah, azithromycin is a very powerful drug. Originally was widely used, for the community treatment of trachoma, and it's very effective for that. It has very unusual pharmacodynamics, so that if you give sometimes one dose, there's quite a few people have been treating conditions with a single dose of azithromycin, or you give a short course. The drug has a very long half-life, and much of that half-life is around the level, close to the level of the minimum inhibitory concentration. In other words, it's highly effective at selecting resistant strains. And in Northern Australia, this was where the first studies were done actually of this. In Northern Australia, it was used again for the treatment management of trachoma. And a study that was published from Darwin showed that after one round of azithromycin community treatment, the rates of resistant organisms were substantially increased. Now, this doesn't apply everywhere, because I think that in those communities in Australia, they were already heavily exposed to antibiotics, so probably many of the resistant strains were there somewhere. But nevertheless, we recognise azithromycin as being a very potent generator of antimicrobial resistance, and it's a real problem. In other respects, it's a very good drug. It's very effective. It's useful for a lot of things. So it's hard to answer that question, but I wouldn't be using anything other than penicillin unless the child was allergic, actually.
Thank you, Prof. Maybe next question I would like to ask Dr. Rini. Dr. Rini, as we know that in Indonesia, in rural area, there is a lot of people still use a firewood stove, and we know that the smoke increase the risk of pneumonia. Do you think there's something that we can do to prevent the pneumonia in this rural area that using the firewood stuff like that, Doctor?
Thank you, Dr. Indri. Well, in the rural area, usually family will use the fire stove like that, and it will cause the air pollution indoor. It is if the house is without appropriate ventilation, so it will be very much the level of the fine particles from what is accepted. So, but it's difficult because they don't have any other tools for cook. So maybe it's the other thing they can do is maybe they can cook outside of the house, so it will decrease the indoor pollution. With that, Dr. Indri. Thank you.
Thank you. So move the firewood outside the house, right, Dr. Rini?
Maybe it's some option.
Thank you, Dr. Rini.
Can I show you a?
Yes, please.
Yes, Prof.
Sorry, can I show you a slide that's relevant to this actually? It just shows you one of the stoves that's been used. Is that okay?
Okay, Prof.
Yes, Prof.
This is, you should see now a picture of a woman kneeling by a fire. Right? This is from Guatemala, and this is in the highlands of Guatemala, and this was the traditional way that women would cook in that environment. And you can see two things in this picture, really. Firstly, that the woman herself is exposed to smoke, and in this environment, in settings like this, and also in north of India, the women have very high rates of chronic obstructive lung disease. But the other thing is the exposure of children is very extreme. And the intervention that was introduced was a locally designed stove. They called it a plancha. And this intervention has a lot of advantages here. Firstly, the woman herself is in a much better situation, her own health. The place is safer, so the risk of children being burned is less. And the child the children are not exposed to smoke because they have a chimney that goes out of the house. It's a very simple, locally produced thing in Guatemala. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. So maybe it can also be done in Indonesia, so using the chimney. Maybe another question. Is there any question from?
Can I ask question, Dr. Indri?
Sure,
or Prof.
sure,
Kim?
definitely.
Okay, so Prof. Kim, in a persistent pneumonia, when you are suspicion that the patient with persistent or recurrent pneumonia is caused by the immune deficiency situation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the immune deficiencies that certainly that we encounter here in Australia do often present with recurrent pneumonia. That's true. Recurrent lower respiratory tract infection. The threshold for investigation, it's a sort of a slow process, and it depends who the child is seeing, but basic investigations will sometimes show that there's at least a risk of an underlying immune deficiency. But if you take all of the children who have recurrent pneumonia, the proportion that have underlying immune deficiency is relatively small, I think. It's more common if a child is having serious recurrent pneumonia. There may be other factors. I mean, we've mentioned malnutrition. Sometimes it's underlying tuberculosis. Sometimes it's a neglected foreign body that can cause trouble. And if you take an X-ray, you see an abscess. There are a lot of different possibilities. And then, of course, there are congenital abnormalities and duplication and so on, which can occur, but these are kind of rare. And in the African context, I think there were probably two things to think about. One of them, of course, was HIV. And the other, in the first year of life, relates to respiratory syncytial virus. We're able to show, and I think it's very clear now, that children that have very severe RSV infections in the first few months of life can have recurrent pneumonia. And that's not seen so much in countries like Australia, where it's mostly wheezing that we see in those children. But in Africa, and I suspect possibly in Indonesia as well, that some of those children will be presenting with recurrent lower respiratory tract infections that will be dating back to their initial RSV illness. And interestingly, in the trial that I was talking about when I was quite critical of the trial from Novavax, what they did show, which nobody really talked about much, was that the children whose mothers were vaccinated during pregnancy, and therefore they avoided having RSV in the first 3 months of life, those children had a significantly reduced number of lower respiratory tract infections over the rest of the coming year, not caused by RSV, just because they had they didn't have the damage that was caused by the RSV infection. So RSV infection in the first 3 months of life does cause damage to children's lungs that can be manifest as recurrent pneumonia. Yes.
Thank you, Prof. Kim. And I would like to ask one more, if it's okay. So in patient with persistent pneumonia or recurrent pneumonia, when is, in your opinion, when is the right time to perform other sophisticated diagnostic tools like chest CT scan when it is necessary to perform the CT scan? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. I think I'm not the best qualified to answer that because I'm not currently in practice, and so in fact, since I left Africa, I've worked only in research and on vaccine-related research predominantly. So I've not been in that situation, but I would have thought that after two serious episodes of pneumonia, and particularly if there is persisting X-ray changes in between the episodes, then that would be probably the time I would think. But I suspect there are people on this call who are better qualified than me to answer that question.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kim.
Thank you, Prof. Kim. Maybe there is a question from participant. Dr. Inke, do you have a question?
Thank you, Dr. Indri. Maybe I have one more question. I would like to ask also about the importance of having like respiratory panel on the PCR, because now almost every hospital, including in Medan, have the PCR machine, and it can help with the correct diagnostic of the pneumonia patient. So what do you think about the importance or the benefits of having the specific diagnostic, because there are many offers now to include not only COVID-19 but also include other respiratory panel in the diagnostic?
Yeah, there's a lot of them around, isn't there? And you know, I think that the most important thing is that you identify things that need specific treatment or specific prevention. And we've had that debate here actually. And for much of the pandemic, the children who've been investigated have had PCR only for SARS-CoV-2, not for other things. And some people, like me, have objected and said, here is an opportunity, we should be looking for RSV and for other things. So now they are doing that. I think RSV is worth looking for because I think it turns out to be a really major pathogen. And I think it will be preventable in the coming years, despite the fact that the companies are going in a funny way at the moment. So it would be worth looking for that. But really, in a research environment, I don't see that that is going to affect your management. So in a research way, you can then use what would be an expensive test in doing a series of a fixed number of cases, severe cases and non-severe cases, maybe following for a year, or there are various ways you can do that to really understand the epidemiology of RSV in your environment, which I suspect will be possibly quite year-round, but with peaks. That would be the most likely thing. But I'm not sure if you've actually done that. Do you have RSV epidemiology there?
Unfortunately, no, but maybe Dr. Rini can add. But even if we do have the data on the RSV, there is now, is there a vaccine for the RSV? I mean, like, so the prevention method would be also like increase the nutrition and also the poverty.
Yeah, so I think one has to be pragmatic. The cost, excuse me, just a minute. Sorry, there's somebody trying to reach me, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, no, I think you have to be pragmatic. I believe that expensive tests are useful, but they have to have a reason. And doing a big panel of tests, there's something called what they call a fire test or something that they're using in some countries. I don't think that it's useful unless it's going to change your management in some way. And we did for a while do RSV testing on all children admitted, in part because we tried to manage them in different rooms than other children, so there wasn't cross-infection. But other than that, it doesn't change your management.
Thank you, Prof. Kim.
Thank you, Prof. Kim. So maybe the examination doesn't really differ the management like that, Prof. So maybe because the time already it's 3 o'clock. So I want to ask last question maybe to Dr. Rini. Until recently, we know that PCV and RSV vaccine is not a basic mandatory vaccine in Indonesia. What do you think the consideration of that from Dr.?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Indri. Well, actually, PCV vaccine, it's not yet included in national program of vaccine in Indonesia, but there is some pilot in Nusa Tenggara and in Bangka Belitung that include the PCV to give to the children there. And actually, the government already tried to buy the PCV with already have agreement with the Gavi, so they can take a PCV for lower price from the market price. So I'm sure in the near future, the PCV will be included in our national guideline for vaccination. Maybe that's Dr. Indri. Dr. Indri, can I ask one more question for Prof. Kim?
Yeah.
The last question, yeah. Okay, so Prof. Kim, I'm interested about the cross protection, about the PCV10 and PCV13. Can you explain more about it? Because in some literature, some studies said there is no cross protection between two of them. Thank you, Prof. Kim.
Yeah, great question. The names of the pneumococcal serotypes, you may have noticed that it's kind of odd. You have a number and then you have a letter. So some of them you just have a number, like serotype 5, for example, and some of them you have a letter and a number. So you can have 6A or 6B, or 19A or 19F. Now, it's a fairly strange system, but the number represents a kind of grouping, serological grouping. In other words, in theory, there is cross immunity between all of the ones that have the same number. 19A, 19F, 6A, 6B, what other ones, 9V, 9F, I think, and 23A and 23F. Now, that does work with some vaccines, but not with others. And I think for 6, there is cross protection. If you look at type 19, for example, 19A was not included in the original Pfizer vaccine, which was actually marketed by Wyeth then. When the Wyeth vaccine was marketed, there was an increase in 19A disease, to everyone's amazement in America, because 19F was in the vaccine and everyone assumed that 19F would cover 19A, but it didn't. It actually led to an increase. On the other hand, when the GSK vaccine was marketed, it also lacked 19A, it had 19F, but the GSK's 19F actually had provided protection against 19A, not complete, but some protection. So it's quite erratic and not very clear. And it's an interesting and good point. I think that we believe that the current or the forthcoming Indian vaccine, which contains both 19A and 19F, and 6A and 6B, will get most of the serotypes covered. I don't think we're going to lose out within a group now anymore like we did with 19A. It was just something peculiar about the Pfizer's 19A vaccine 19F vaccine that failed to protect against 19A, and it was a very disturbing sequence of events.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kim. There's very insightful information. And maybe due to the time limitation, discussion session. Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, finally we come to the end of the part of today's webinar. I would like to say thanks once again to our speaker, Prof. Kim and Dr. Rini for the very informative and interesting presentation. And to all of the audience for the participation. Hopefully this session will be beneficial for everybody. Thank you for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Now I give it.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kim. See you later.
Terima kasih. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof.
See you later.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Rini. Thank you, Dr. Rini, for the lectures. And finally, we get to the last session. For the participant, please fill the absence and please give us the feedback to improve our event next time. Then, thank you for attention and time. Hopefully, the webinar will give the knowledge of pneumonia for us. See you in the next event. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good afternoon.
Terima kasih semuanya, Prof. Dokter.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.